In this episode, we are going to talk to Mr. Stephen Petty, a certified industrial hygienist who has testified in court for hundreds of cases. He's an expert on hazardous particulates. He's done anthrax sampling. He's testified all over the country. We're going to get into a topic that maybe a couple of years ago would have been considered taboo. We probably wouldn't have been able to have this discussion the way we're going to have it today. And we're going to get into why that is. And I am going to warn you all, this is not an episode that I want you to listen to because I want to convince you of anything. I want you to listen to this episode objectively and then go out and look at this information, look at this data for yourself. And after our interview, I will come back and kind of wrap it up with my personal thoughts. And I'm going to let the episode stand. I think it was a good episode. We had a great conversation. I respect his background and experience, and I really liked his approach with focusing or shifting our focus from PPE, people-based solutions, more to engineering controls, and that is diluting, removing, or killing the virus in the air so the public can actually be safe versus just feeling like they're safer and doing little to nothing else. Let's get into this episode with Mr. Stephen Petty. Before we get into today's topic, I have one question for you. Are you still painting your floors for 5S markings, things like that? Don't do that. Head over to mightylinetape.com/podcast, a great partner in safety. They've been with us from the beginning. They have some really good products that are going to get you out of a whole lot of time, material, and maintenance and upkeep. Their floor marking tape is second to none. It takes up easily, doesn't leave a sticky residue. They've got floor tape with beveled edges for forklift traffic, carts, things like that. So it really holds up well to that kind of traffic in your facility. They also can do custom floor signs. If you have a particular logo or a message, they can make that happen. Get a free sample and try it for yourself. Again, head over to mightylinetape.com/podcast. Tell them that we sent you. You will get a free sample to try out in your facility today. Again, mightylinetape.com/podcast. All right. Hey, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us on the Safety Pro podcast. We've been wanting to talk about this topic for a long time. I get a lot of requests from listeners and fellow safety pros, colleagues of mine via LinkedIn, text, email, asking about what's going on for over the last 2 years, by the way, what's going on with these masks. All of a sudden, it just came out of nowhere, it seems like. So I thought we would have an expert. I'll let you define what that is because there's actually a legal definition of an expert, so which is interesting. And I'll let you introduce yourself, give us a little bit about your background, what you've done in this space, and we'll get into that topic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Stephen Petty. My background is I'm a certified industrial hygienist, a certified safety professional, which is sort of like an OSHA expert, and then a professional engineer as well. I've I've been working in these areas for almost over 40 years. I have sort of a bifurcated past. I'm an expert have written a textbook on forensics engineering. And then in parallel with that, I am an expert in testifying on exposure controls, PPE, and warnings, things like MSDSs. And I've testified and named, at least as an expert, in upwards of 400 cases. So, and beginning about 2 years ago, this masking thing came up. I'd spent my entire career protecting workers and the public from exposure to chemicals, biotoxins, et cetera. I'd sampled for anthrax, biotoxins, Legionella, mold, bacteria, all kinds of things. And the mask issue troubled me greatly because, which was a surprise to some people that I came out against them, because they don't protect people. They're not PPE. They're not protective. And I felt that they were mainly a political solution and not a technical solution. So I began to speak out as a known expert in the area, ultimately developed a series of handouts, went to all kinds of meetings on my own nickel, developed video podcasts, etc., testified in court cases. In fact, a year ago, I testified in the state of Kentucky, and as a result, at least in part from that testimony, the mask mandate was overturned statewide. So there are real solutions with engineering controls of dilution, filtration, and destruction that actually work. And those solutions have been available to us in the industrial hygiene community since 1950. The National Safety Council gave those to us in what we call the hierarchy of controls. Masks don't even fit in that hierarchy. And so I've been rather outspoken saying that this is more politics than it is real solutions to protect people.
Okay, so let me go back to what you said earlier. You said you've been named as an expert in court cases. You know, when people say, hey, I'm an expert in, or, you know, you see LinkedIn and they say in their title, influencer, you know, expert. There's a legal definition when we talk about in testifying and in court cases. Walk us through that. How, when you're an expert witness, what does that mean legally?
Legally, the definition is that you're an expert based on education, training, and experience. And so those are the three words, education, training, experience, that are used to define whether or not you're truly an expert. And the courts have to approve that you are, and you can be challenged by the opposing side in what they call Daubert or Fry hearings. I've been challenged many, many times, and one of the few industrial hygienists who's tested. I have not been precluded from testifying in any court that I'm aware of. Good.
So I wanted to make sure we understood for our listeners and those watching on the Safety Pro podcast community that, you know, expert, when we use that word in our discussion, we're talking about, you know, in the legal sense, a recognized expert that has some, you know, what you say in when you're testifying has some weight that they will actually consider what you're saying in their decision. So that's important. And then you also you said mask when you come up with mask. Well, you know, that's a general term, and we're talking to safety professionals, so I think we understand what we mean. But for our discussion, let's define that. Well, we're talking about the face coverings, correct? Not respirators.
Right. I mentioned earlier to you this thing called hierarchy of controls, and this is sort of our baseline on how we protect people as industrial hygienists. And there are a number of ways to do that. The ones that are most appropriate for infectious diseases would be as engineering controls of dilution, filtration, and destruction that I talked about. At the bottom of that list is PPE, and for inhalation protection would be respirators. And respirators are at the bottom of the list because we know in the real world that it's hard for people to wear them for long periods of time and maintain their integrity. So they're, in many respects, they're sort of a temporary solution till we get the engineering controls in place to remove or dilute the hazard away or take the hazard away. What's interesting is masks don't even fit in that hierarchy. They're below the hierarchy. So if respirators are on the bottom, and there's a whole series of kinds of respirators, masks don't even fit in that category. And why do I say that? Well, even if you go, there's been this terminology of face coverings or masks. I'll use those interchangeably. But, you know, there was a rush by ASTM to put out this face covering or mask standard. And what's curious about it, and OSHA's touted it in their page, but what's really curious about that standard is that it says right in the standard that face coverings are not PPE or personal protective equipment. So that's a tacit admission that masks aren't a real solution. What you find in whether it be OSHA or particularly in CDC is they'll make allusions to the fact that perhaps masking works, but then when you read down deep into the fine print, if you will, they basically say they don't. And this is part of what's so disturbing about the politicization of our public health agencies, because it really confuses the lay people as to what the right answer is.
And, you know, it's dangerous, too, I would say. I would go even further. And this is me talking. I think it can be dangerous when you falsely, knowingly or unknowingly, okay, I'll give some credit to our public officials, our politicians, and assume maybe some of them just don't know. They're taking it on face value that these things are effective. They're like, hey, this doctor says it's going to work, so you got to wear it. You could be actually putting people in more harm, right? You create this, and as safety professionals, we know this, you create this false sense of security. Hey, I've got a mask on. I can go and do things I normally wouldn't do, right? Or places I normally wouldn't go right now because there is poor ventilation, because there are no engineering controls in place. I would go to this crowded theater, or I would go because we're all wearing masks. It's okay. And that could actually lead to more exposure, one could argue, right?
Well, absolutely. And you touched on several topics that need to be addressed, and I'll touch them briefly, and then we can go into more deeply if you want. One was that people listen to doctors. Well, the problem is doctors are not industrial hygienists. They have the exact wrong background. And unfortunately, the field of industrial hygiene isn't well recognized, and people are listening to doctors, and it's sort of like going to your doctor to have your car repaired or be your chief cook. They may be talented people, but they're in the wrong sandbox. But nevertheless, they're taken as gospel or God. The other thing that I don't think it's as accidental as you think, because there's been hundreds of, if not tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to use behavioral psychology tools. And one of my backgrounds was that I finished first in my class, and aside from the technical degrees, as an MBA, and was trained on how to persuade people as far as behavioral marketing. And they're using these tools that really do confuse and cause the dangers you talked about. One is, in order of effectiveness in terms of persuading people, the number one way to do it is fear. People who are afraid coil up in a ball and they do what they're told. So if you're told it's going to kill you or really hurt you or your family, you do what you're told naturally. The next one is emotional appeal. I always say, okay, if it's a mask, wear a mask to protect your fellow citizens or your family or your parents or whatever. It's very effective. Then the third most effective way is propaganda, which it really means, it's not such a negative word, it just means repeated message. Say the same thing over and over and over again. Wear a mask, wear a mask, wear a mask. And the least effective argument is logic, which is masks don't work. So when you realize that, I'll tell you a true story. When I was leaving, I flew to Ohio and then I drove to Kentucky to testify on the governor's mask mandate against it. And on the way back, I heard at least 3 public address messages from CDC to wear a mask to protect your family, protect your loved ones, protect your coworkers. This language isn't accidental when you have background in the art of persuasion, that these tools are being used on the airwaves constantly. And so I'm not so inclined to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think this is intentional. Maybe there are some ignorant people in it, but that's because they've been persuaded by those who are using these tools. So
right. It's
a little bit aside from some of the technical things you hear, but people have to recognize that very powerful tools for persuasion are being used, particularly in the area of masking and face coverings. And our own governmental agencies like CDC are front and center in doing that.
Yeah, I went out to eat recently. After we had been talking and setting up this interview, I've been looking forward to this discussion for a while now. I went out to eat the other night, and my wife's birthday. We went to a local restaurant. I noticed, we were talking about the art of persuasion, and you're so spot on with this. We did have to mobilize the public behind something, right? And so this is what they mobilized behind, was the mask, and they used all of those things. I saw this giant sign, like a billboard, in the foyer of the entryway of the restaurant, and it's the Be Kind billboard. It had the mask with a little heart, like where the little exhalation valve would go or something. It had a little heart, and it just said Be Kind. That's that emotional appeal. That's it implies that if I'm not wearing it, I'm mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly powerful. These tools work.
Yeah,
that's what makes this whole mask issue or face covering so difficult, is that the behavioral sciences tools are being used to perpetuate it. And so one has to be, so careful to try to get a message out that fights that. But it's a tough fight. And,
It is.
The biggest issue is, we mentioned earlier, doctors, and you can't hardly go to a public health facility and see your doctor without them forcing you to wear a mask. So people believe that physicians are there for their best interest and care, at least in general. But they're as a whole, they're either persuaded or ignorant, or some combination thereof. I have an appointment today to go see a doctor, and they've told me that unless I wear a mask, they won't see me.
Wow.
So, and this is the third time that's happened. And I don't go. My wife says, well, why won't you go? And I said, you know what? The second I give up, if we don't have some pushback, even if it affects my health, then where are we? If I'm in a position where I'm as knowledgeable as anybody out there as an expert, and I concede to that, then what's the point?
Right.
So, it's irritating, but one of our biggest challenges is that the government has persuaded these big medical healthcare companies, of which most of the doctors now work for, that one must wear a mask. This is part of and it's part of this whole persuasive thing. I think it's the biggest challenge we have to get the science to work as opposed to the politics. And that is, in the medical healthcare arena, we have non-industrial hygienists, non-experts, but experts viewed by the public, constantly telling you basically masks work.
Right.
And it is because there are very few industrial hygienists, frankly, versus doctors. And doctors come with a reputation for helping you. And in fact, some of the studies we'll probably get into show increasingly they actually cause more harm than good.
Yeah.
And this isn't a surprise because we've known this for years.
Yeah, you're so right on that. There's even research when we, with some of my background, I had to kind of self-learn. Back when I was a consultant, I had to learn marketing, advertising, things like that on my own as a small business owner. One of the books I read, there was a study that showed that just like companies that want to sell supplements, no FDA clearance or approval, but it's a supplement, so it's not regulated. But in order for them to sell their supplement, they did studies and they said just putting somebody in a television commercial with a white coat, that's all they had to do was put an actor with a white lab coat. It automatically instilled a sense of authority of that expert, right? We attribute that expertise to doctors. And as I say, we're not bashing doctors. They're very good at what they do. I trust my doctors wholly. But again, the joke I've said is we had people that couldn't spell PPE 2 years ago. Now all of a sudden are experts on masks and respirators and everything else. So my next story is, go ahead.
Let me give you an example though of that. When I work in litigation, like I'm one of the experts in the Monsanto Roundup cases, and I'm the exposure PPE warnings expert. Well, I figure out their exposure. I figure out what protection they had or didn't have and what warnings they were given, MSDSs, et cetera, what training. The physician is there, or the medical person, to once I do the exposure, they say, yeah, that exposure caused her disease or it didn't. But they're not there to do the exposure analysis or the PPE analysis, et cetera. So what's troubling here is that this whole, the biggest issue we have is the one that we've been touching on, which is trying to educate the public in an emotionally effective way that what they're being told is wrong and that the physicians are not the experts. And that is a big mountain or hill to overcome. And but when you look at the litigation process, you don't have medical doctors doing the exposure analysis. This is being done by industrial hygienists like myself and people with specific background in exposure or PPE or warnings. And I used an example. There was a case that came up where I was testifying in New Hampshire. It's gotten a lot of views in front of the Senate. And one of the persons on the panel that was listening to me talk was a Democrat in this case, who was I was told was thinking of running for governor, and he was a medical doctor, and he wanted to light me up, right? I mean, show that I give a soundbite. And I said, that's fine. Let him ask his questions. I'm all for the debate. And I said, I'll ask him a single question when he questions me. I'll say, okay, let's assume I was on the second floor, that there's an outbreak of anthrax on the floor below. We're going to send you, or they're going to send me? You're not going to send a medical doctor to go deal with it.
What are they going to do?
Exposure outbreak. I mean, you're going to send an industrial hygienist to figure out what's going on and how to protect people. And so, but this, we've touched on it, that the white coat has enormous power psychologically, and it's a big hill to overcome.
It is. I went to the dentist, and I love our dentist. I'm not going to name the dentist because it's not about them. It's about what we've been talking about. It's that this influence, and you're right. A lot of medical facilities or systems, I should say, healthcare systems or networks, they are largely dependent on federal funding in Medicaid, Medicare reimbursements and things like that. And so, it's real easy for the federal government to tie their money to a policy, meaning, well, if you don't require this, you can no longer be reimbursed for, Medicare, Medicaid, and that's how they make an end run around actually passing laws that they probably wouldn't be able to pass.
That is happening. If you read Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book on the real Dr. Anthony Fauci,
yes,
he documents this in spades, and so you've got this. What's so disturbing is that you've had the corruption of our public health agencies, FDA, NIH, CDC, who used to be sort of watchdogs that would protect us from unscrupulous behavior. But they've now become politicized to the extent that they don't really serve as a watchdog anymore. That's the disturbing part of this. They've become proponents of certain policies. I'll call it political, because I don't know how else to describe it. And I'm not even saying which side political. I'm just saying political.
Right. Yeah.
And they're spending, as I said before, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars messaging this. You hear it on the radio and the TV all the time. And you see it, as you say, in all sorts of public forums. And, what's disturbing is early on, they had this 6-foot rule. And I was like, well, this is insane. Yeah. Since when did an aerosol decide at 6 feet it's just going to stop? I mean, this is how stupid that sounds. Sure enough, Scott, I could never find any literature, and I looked for a year and a half, that showed anywhere that 6 feet had anything to do with anything. And sure enough, Scott Gottlieb came out in late 2001, who was a former FDA commissioner, and said, well, there was no basis for the 6-foot rule. I think what surprised the people pushing this was that people were so compliant. This just stunned them, I think, that people would put a rag over their face and stand 6 feet apart with no signs.
So I'm going to the dentist. I go into the lobby and they have a sign. It says, hey, we have increased community spread. Masks are now required again. I'm like, oh, man, I didn't even bring one. So I walk in. I stand at the counter. She slides the window open. And I said, hey, I don't have a mask. Do you have one? Oh, yeah, I've got one. So, I'm already in there. No mask. I'm talking to her. No mask. They have a mask on, just a face covering. It's a paper one. She hands me the mask. I put it on. I go sit in the lobby in a chair by myself. Nobody else in there. They opened the door, said, hey, Blaine, we're ready for you. Come on in. And I get up. I go to the door and I'm about to walk through the door. She's like, you could take the mask up. It's just in the waiting room with other people. It's okay back here. It's open. There are patients in chairs with their mouths wide open, getting drilled and sprayed in water, air. And I'm like, and I looked at her and I'm like, I tried to be funny. I'm like, so out there by myself, I got to wear it.
But in here, she just shrugged. and that's the thing. They're checking a box. I think most people know, but they're like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? So I got two questions for you. We'll start with the first one. Why doesn't that work? That scenario I just laid out, like, and you said aerosols decide 6 feet's enough, right? So that's key. We know large droplets. We learned early on that was not the mode of transmission. It was aerosolized particulates in the air. The virus is in the air. Why don't face coverings work? Like, what's the data say? Like, what does Stephen say about how this works, exposure works in this case?
Yeah, let me give you an example, and I'll go through that. Let's imagine, let's take their position that masks work, and let's assume that they're perfectly sealed. That's why most of the mask studies put them on boards, either seal them on boards or mannequins with glue. So that's not how your real mask works. But let's assume that it has zero penetration and that it's perfectly sealed. Let's assume that it would protect against a particulate nerve agent, just for example's sake. Now, let's say you walk into this waiting room and it's full of nerve agent, and none of this is true. Your mask is perfectly sealed. But anyway, it's protecting you, right? Mm-hmm. How long do you think you last if you take it off? 30 seconds? So what changed? If the room's full of, let's pretend instead of a nerve agent, it's now high levels of coronavirus. So, okay, let's assume it worked perfectly, and then you take it off. So what protection have you given yourself? None. I mean, it's a completely illogical, stupid argument. But to go to your question more detailed, I sent you some material, but on the January presentation on page 17, I quote some work by Edwards, who showed that upwards of, and it's on pages 17 and 18, that upwards of 99.9% of the particles emitted are aerosols. Now, what's an aerosol? An aerosol, for those of us with a health and safety background, is a particle that's 5 microns or less. It's the respirable particles as opposed to the non-respirable. Well, the CDC makes, and to this day they make this argument, mask top droplets. Well, it's like shining a shining light off to something that we don't really care about. I mean, if 99.9% of the particles are not droplets, shouldn't we be focused on that? And more importantly, as I show on just using what we call Stokes' law, assuming that you had still air, how long would it take particles of different sizes and densities to fall, say, 5 feet? You find that droplets between 10 and 100 microns, this is on page 21 of my handouts, would fall to the ground in a matter of minutes. But if you look at aerosols, and the COVID is somewhere between, it's reported between 0.09 and 0.12 microns, we're talking about days, and in fact, tens of days to fall to the ground. So I say to people, let's assume that you're in a store and somebody was really sick the day before, not 50 days earlier, but a day earlier. And you walk through this plume, because the air conditioning is not that great. And this stuff stays suspended. You know how that is. We're not in still air. We're in air that moves, so it keeps this stuff suspended even longer. And you don't have a COVID meter on your chest or your head or whatever, so you don't know where that plume is. Well, so these aerosols are important because they're very small. They reach the deep lung. They stay in the air a long time. And the only real solution is the solution we've had since the National Safety Council gave it to us, is we either dilute it out, we filter it out, or we destroy it, because you can't run meters on everybody's heads or chests to know whether you just ran into that plume. And so that's why all of this science is sort of important. It's kind of in the weeds, but it goes to the point that the solution they're suggesting is wrong, which is, wear a mask. And the other thing that I point out in this presentation is that there was work by Drunick, who was an honest broker. He was doing studies on how well different mask or face covering materials worked. And he said, well, what if I what if I put a hole, because he's got them perfectly sealed, right? And he knows that's not real. So he's on page 26, I show his data of this presentation, and I extrapolate it. And as he says, well, if I have 2% of the mask opening is actually, he puts a hole in the mask, right? Because it's perfectly sealed in his experiment. And he says, well, if 2% of the mask opening would represent a gap, which is not very much,
right,
I lose 75% of whatever effectiveness that mask had. So
wow.
I said, well, it looks like a linear curve. So if I stretch it out, it looks like when you get to around 3% gap area, you have 0% effectiveness. Ignore the mask entirely. You can assume it's 100% effective.
And that when what you're simulating there is just the gaps around the sides of the nose, under the eyes, off to the sides, because everybody's face is different. These things are not form fitting.
If you have, and we know if you have facial hair like you do,
right, you
have zero seal and even a respirator.
I've shared a photo. I created a meme and I shared it on Twitter, and that was somebody with a half face piece respirator with some smoke around them, and it's a picture of a worker stock image. And I said, I did a little snip of the OSHA interpretation of facial hair and how it's required to be clean shaven or nothing interfering with the seal. And then I put also OSHA. And I put a picture of a guy with a full beard with it's like this little paper mask. I said, also OSHA, wear one of these for COVID. It's just, it makes absolutely no sense.
Well, I've got a graphic. Let me jump around. On page 27, I have a true story. Early in 2020, I was flying a lot and I didn't know what was going on. So I wore my half face respirator with the particulate filters. And I was almost booted off the planes twice. And finally, they said, you have to wear a mask. And I said, well, I don't want to unprotect myself.
Right.
Well, this was foreign to the flight attendants. Finally, the pilot said, the only way I'm letting you fly is if you stick a mask inside your respirator. So that's how stupid this is. So anyway, I took the Spirit Airlines mask, and on page 27, I actually calculated the gap area around the mask. Because remember, I'm saying 3% of the area means it has zero effectiveness, right? So I've got a graphic on page 27 where I measure all these areas, and I found that the areas, especially below the eyes on either side of the nose, and then the little crinkled up areas, was 9% of the total mask area. Well, at 3%, it's zero. So I basically showed that it doesn't work at all. Yeah. Now, in answer to your question about OSHA, I've got a slide on what OSHA says on page 13 of the same presentation. They sort of say, well, we recommend you wear a mask, right? And I've got the URL on that slide. But you have on page 1 or so, they say wear a mask, but here's on page 6 what they say. They say, surgical masks are not respirators and do not provide the same level of protection to workers as properly fitted respirators. Cloth face coverings are also not acceptable substitutes for respirators. Yeah. Now, appreciate that for asbestos workers, we never put those people in N95s even, right? We put them in PAPRs, which are higher level pressurized air supply respirators. And the asbestos particle on average is 50 times larger. So why in the world would we ever put somebody in a N95 for a particle that's much smaller? I mean, this is nonsense. So this is the little dance that these guys play. They've got their lawyers working overtime in the background. They say, well, we do recommend. Now, recommend doesn't mean require that you wear a mask, right? But then you go to the details, which, of course, only people like me would go to the details, right? And you read, well, what are they saying further on in this document? And they basically say they're not acceptable substitutes for respirators. Well, what's that mean? That means to me, as a health and safety professional, that they're not protective. And this is why they don't even fit on the hierarchy of controls. They're below it.
Yeah, they're not even on the radar.
They're not on the radar. And so I actually show that language. And it's funny because on page 14, CDC does the exact same thing. They've taken this down, but I have it and it shows mask versus respirator. Let me read you just two things.
Is that the OSHA publication?
No, this is the CDC one. I just cited the OSHA.
OSHA used to have a page too that said face mask versus surgical mask. It's no longer, it's gone. But the publication, the official federal publication is still there. You just have to search it.
I still have it on page 14. And it says under mask, it says, do not provide the wearer with a reliable level of protection from inhaling smaller airborne particles. It is not considered respiratory protection.
Yes.
And then it says under masks, leakage occurs around the edge of the mask when user inhales. Well, and then on respirators, it says, for an N95, filters out 95% airborne particles, including large and small particles. Well, to a point, but not aerosols. And then down to 0.3 microns it might. And then it says, when properly fitted and done, minimal leakage occurs around the edges. This is for a respirator. Yeah. So they've got this comparison that basically shows masks don't do anything, or they're not protective.
The face mask versus surgical mask publication that OSHA has, and I'll share a snip. I'll put on the screen for everybody. And by the way, all the graphics, if you go to the Safety Pro podcast community site, you'll be able to see the full video interview for those of you listening in the podcast world to the audio only. But they say clearly, like, the differences between a face covering and a surgical mask. They weren't even talking about respirators. They were just talking about, I remember the CDC came out and for like a minute, maybe 5 minutes tops, they were saying surgical masks are better. And then they quickly moved off of that. Well, I got this OSHA publication, and you're right. It says essentially the same thing. It says, it's like a warning. These are not approved for use in preventing the transmission of diseases.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's a surgical mask.
Right. And in fact, on pages 28 and 29 of this same presentation, I show some evidence from, the evidence we have prior to COVID was study after study showing that, and I cite Zhao and others, they say, however, overall, there's a lack of substantial evidence to support claims that face masks protect either the patient or surgeon from infectious contamination. And that's because of all the issues we've been talking about. You can't seal them. I always tell everybody, this source control argument makes me want to pull my hair out too, because this is some assumption that if you wear a mask, somehow you as the infected person stop material from getting out to the public around you. And I said, well, if you got a super freeway around the edges of your mask, does it really care whether this stuff's coming in or out? I appreciate that the COVID particle is on the order of 1/1000th the diameter of a human hair. So let's imagine you're wearing facial hair. You got dozens of super freeways, but you don't even have to be in that situation. Just look at the gaps around, that I show in that picture I have on either side of your nose, below your eyes. There's big gaps, let alone where it crinkles up. You can put your small finger through there most of the time. And we're talking about thousands of hairs, and those hairs are all 1,000 times greater in diameter than the COVID particle. So this argument about source control, I started hearing that, and I'm like, what? This had to be done it can't have been done by scientists. I mean, it had to be done by some sort of policy makers who were promoting an agenda, because you just start laughing when you sit and think about it for a few seconds. But basically the early history we have on face coverings, whether it be masks or surgical masks or whatever you want to call them, really had to do with the flu, which is also a virus, same size particle, basically. Mm-hmm. And there's never been any data that showed any difference between wearing or not wearing a mask and infectious disease rates. Mm-hmm. And we see that now in the legitimate, I call it legitimate, COVID masking studies. The only studies I've done it in court, and I've done it directly to CDC. I've criticized the studies they cite because they suffer from one of two flaws. Either they don't have a control group, and what do I mean by that? If you're going to measure and say that this community is wearing a mask and that made a difference, then you need as close to the same group as that not wearing a mask to see what their disease rates are, and then you compare the two.
Right.
But if you don't have a control group and you say, well, masks work, well, on what basis? I mean, you're not comparing it to anything. The other thing is they confound it. In other words, they have multiple things going on at the same time. They change air conditioning, they use separation, they use isolation, and then they do masking. And they say, see, we had a difference, masks work. And you're like, well, how do you separate out the mask effect from the air conditioning effect, from the isolation effect, et cetera? You can't. And so almost every one of these studies suffer from a combination of those sorts of faults. And I went through upwards of 30 of the CDC studies and showed that either there's one study the CDC cites that say masks work, that when you read the study, the only citation to masks is that the study cites CDC saying masks work.
They cited themselves?
They cited themselves.
That's science. We got to follow the science, though.
Well, that's the other argument. The biggest argument, and it's good for your audience because they're going to need tools. The biggest argument that you hear all the time, and I've seen it in court, that they come against me as an expert, is they say, well, you're Mr. Petty, you're just one guy, and CDC is 11,000 people, and the weight of evidence, CDC is smarter as a body than you are. Or maybe not smarter, but they have a weight of evidence is the term that's used. And I've come up with a great response to that, I think, that your audience can use, and that is I always tell the judge, well, which version of CDC guidance do you want me to follow? Do you want me to follow the early 2020 guidance that masks don't work, or the late 2000 guidance that masks do work, or the early 2021 guidance they don't work, or the late 2021 guidance they do work, or the early 2022 guidance that they really don't work, let's use N95s. So which guidance do you want me to follow? You say, well, we're following CDC guidance. And I'm like, well, what guidance? I said, what science in reality changes its position 180 degrees, mask, no mask, twice in 2 years? I'm not aware of any science that does that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so what can... So this is the challenge, right? It's almost like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. We know this. If we're safety professionals or certified industrial hygienists, and we're looking at this and we're going, wait a minute, that little covering, like, to your point, and I've used this hypothetical as well. Well, okay, so if an employer said to OSHA, well, they're working with silica dust over there, there is a potential exposure, but that's okay. We've got them in face masks. And OSHA there was no way they would accept that. Right. No way. But if that same employer said, wait a minute, everybody else that walks through our front door, you have told us we have to follow CDC guidelines. CDC guidelines, and I know it says guidelines, but I'll get there in a moment. CDC guidelines says everyone has to wear a high quality cloth face covering. So we're doing, or even if I give them the KN95, which is not even recognized by NIOSH. N95 is a NIOSH rating. KN95 is I can tell you a story about that. So let's say we even have some people that prefer to wear the KN95, little duck bill, I call it, and then but then the local health authority, the local politicians and lawmakers have basically required us to wear these by law, or they will shut our business down. They will fine us or shut us down. So all of that weight of all of that influence has led us to mask everybody in the building. So the virus, and it will help stop the spread. The virus is how many times smaller than silica? And we're talking about silica. You mentioned asbestos. Well, what about silica dust? I mean, you could see that.
Silica is many, many times. Well, you've got the respirable portion and non-respirable portion, so you got to kind of take an average of that. So you can go to ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, and there's a plot. If you go to the 22nd presentation, page 22, ASHRAE has put out this table on the size of particles, or the range of size of particles, and it's been out there as long as I've been around. They haven't changed it. It's in the fundamentals handbook, and it's a plot of the range of different particle sizes. And to your point, you can see the relative sizes of these particles. Like mold spores range from 2 to about 50 microns. So that's up to 500 times bigger, for example.
Wow. Bacteria
are 1 to 5 microns. So they're 10 to 50 times larger. That's why you'll see on some of these masks that they have N95s will partially stop some larger bacteria. But they never mention the word virus, because viruses are some of the smallest particles that we know, other than if you go to nanoparticles.
Yeah.
So
they pass through a lot of material.
Yeah. So, but to answer your question as to how you handle this, the industrial hygienists have two responsibilities. One is to begin to understand and persuade people that to let people understand that they're being conned, okay, by these emotional propaganda, fear tactics. And then secondly, to repeat over and over again, doctors are not exposure professionals in general. We are. And then at some level, you have to have some level of civil disobedience. I hate to say that. I've testified against public health officials, and they are the most ignorant people, local public health officials. I mean, if you listen to the testimony in federal court that I gave against a public health official closing down a community with masking, I absolutely destroyed her testimony. Now, the judge had to do figure eights to decide against us, although it's being appealed in the Sixth Circuit, by saying, well, you're just one person and she's citing CDC, right?
Right.
So
going back to that.
They go back to this I'm just citing CDC as some excuse. And I'm like, well, if you actually read their studies that they use to support their positions, they're completely flawed.
Right.
So what I've spent my last 2 years doing is preparing all kinds of materials, including video podcasts, to arm local people with the ammunition they need to make these arguments. And I've done it for hundreds of people. And will it make a difference at the end of the day? I don't know. I'm just one person. But you got to try.
So, Stephen, let me ask you, let me stick with this for a moment, because, all politics is local, right?
Right.
If we're going to go with the politics argument, local communities, by and large, still had the final say in most states, not all, but so is that the mess? That's what I was going to ask you. My next question is like, what can we as safety professionals do to help this? And I think you just nailed it, which is, go talk to the local city council. Go present to the school board that they're local community members as well. And they don't have backgrounds, and maybe they have a background in business. Maybe they have a background. They used to be a teacher, but you look at the general average makeup of a school board.
They're making decisions based on the persuasive tools being used by our public health agencies.
Yes.
And it's understandable why they might have the positions they have, but they're wrong. Now, what I've done is I've volunteered dozens of times to speak via Zoom to school boards, city councils. I have a rule of thumb. If they give me a minute, I won't talk to them, because that means they're not serious. If they give me 5 minutes or 10 minutes, then I have a chance of providing them with some real information, and I'll send them additional information. But that's the key, is to get serious time where you can persuade these people. And it's not that hard once you start to talk to them. And one of the tools that I've used over and over again is, let's make masks optional. This gives them some political cover.
Right.
Let's not say they're banned. Let's just say they're optional.
Right.
And in that case, you begin to win the battle. So, because as soon as you say you're making them optional, the reality is you're sort of admitting they don't work, right?
Right.
But you give political cover to the people that are been brainwashed. My words.
And I think that anybody listening and watching that asks, like, okay, Stephen, Blaine, this is all great. I get it. I agree. I mean, the science is pretty clear. However, it's still a local ordinance. It's still it's still mandated by the government. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what Stephen says. It doesn't matter what Blaine says. It doesn't matter what I say. I still have to do it. That's the problem.
That's why I've been working with local communities, because I think it starts there one at a time, doing the same work you're doing. I mean, the other thing that I should add is that beginning in August of 2020, I helped in put these engineering controls in a special needs autistic high school of 700 students in Westerville, Ohio, who the school marm, the owner of the school, did not want the kids in masks because it was affecting learning. And we now have data that clearly shows it affects learning.
Absolutely. Yes.
So one of the big arguments I make on the emotional appeal side, if you will, is that masks harm our children. Quit harming our children. You have to have, that resonates with people, right? And it's true that is the case. And then I say, but there are some real, I don't want to just be negative. I say, but there are some real solutions. And you'll see at the tail end of both presentations, I've given real engineering control solutions to people to use, and they're being implemented. The school that I worked with in 2020, they've gone almost 2 years now and had almost not zero COVID, but the few cases they've had came in. Mm-hmm. They're almost certain of that, but just a handful, and they've operated with no masks the whole time. Now, there was a big fight with the state of Ohio, seemingly, but what they did was very smart. They said, okay, we'll bring our expert in, Petty, but unless you bring a CIH in, we're not putting him in. We're not going to spend the time and the resources with him if you're going to bring some bureaucrat in to argue with him. We want a true expert. Well, they can never produce a true expert to debate me.
Because a CIH that's not politically driven, right? The knows this data, understands this.
I mean, this hierarchy of controls, I've for people that are in the audience, there's a nice plot, and I'll reference you real quick, that just shows it very succinctly on slide number 11 of that January presentation. And it's just black and white. And this has been known to us in our community since the National Safety Council put it in place in 1950. One of the arguments you get, though, all the time is, well, don't masks do some good? You know?
Yes, but it might do something, so why not wear it?
Yeah, so there are a couple of arguments I make against that. One, if you go to the presentation on where you can see it graphically, the American Industrial Hygiene Association, one of our trade groups, put some guidance out in September of 2020 that looked at what's required for protecting the public. And they said, look, you have to have a 90% relative risk reduction for a solution for us to implement it. And what are they really saying? It would be like me saying, let's put face masks on asbestos workers, and we might save 1 or 2% or even 5% from asbestosis. Well, and the rest of them get cancer, right?
Right.
Well, I don't think that would be a very acceptable solution for the other 95 to 99% that got sick.
Right.
So we don't have a 1% or a 5% solution. When we provide solutions to the public, they have to protect the vast majority of people. And that's what AIHA said. In fact, interestingly enough, they said that face coverings only protect somewhere between 5 and 10% in terms of relative risk reduction when there's a requirement for 90.
So, and by the way, that's in perfect usually these studies are under perfect conditions.
Yeah, where they glue the mask to the face.
Right.
Do
you remember that study? What country did they use? It's probably the one that's most widely cited, but it has been just completely deconstructed by everybody.
Allah Bangladesh study.
Yes, 300 some thousand people that they studied, and they said that the masks were effective. And it turns out what they left out was that was based on 23 infections. The difference in 23 maybe or something.
Yeah, and there were all kinds of biases on the control and non-control group. But this study has been totally trashed. But here's an interesting thing. I just wrote a commentary yesterday. The CDC came out with some new guidance on August 11th with regards to vaccinated versus people that had gotten COVID. So that now they were treated the same. And somebody wrote to me, but see, they changed the mask guidance. And I went in and I looked and I said, no, they haven't. They're still citing, I kid you not, they're citing the Bangladesh study as the basis for continuing to have people wear masks. You can't make this up.
So requiring 320,000 citizens to wear a mask and maybe at best get a difference, if all else was fine with the study, which we know it wasn't, but let's say it was, a difference in 23 infections or 25, less than 25 infections difference. 320 some thousand people. Like to your point, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel with protective factor.
There are others that have done detailed analysis on that. And if I had a year's worth of graduate level statistics, and you can use statistics in a fair way and you can play with them as well.
Yes.
What's that old joke? There's statistics, and damn lies.
Damn lies, yeah.
So people have run the statistics in a more proper way, at least from their perspective, and show that there's no difference. And this is despite huge biases where they were incentivizing people that wore masks to wear them, and then they really never had any control to know which groups were wearing them and for how long and when. I mean, the study is a case study and a completely uncontrolled control study.
And they relied on surveys. They relied on individuals self-reporting that they may have worn a mask at some point during the exposure time. Like, it was so vague. I don't even know how that would stand up publicly to scrutiny, how they would use that.
It's even, they reported people in self-reporting disease.
Yes.
So very few people were actually tested to know whether they already had COVID or not.
Prior, right.
So they looked at antibodies. Well, if you started the study on, pick a date, the first of the month, but they'd had COVID the year before, they'd have antibodies in their body. Well, they would be considered to be, have the disease potentially. So that there were all kinds of problems with that study. And yet, I kid you not, I did a review yesterday of the new guidance from CDC. They're still citing the February 28th, 2022, and the 11/21 studies that are completely flawed. And this is despite the fact that myself and 7 other IHs wrote a very long, detailed letter to CDC saying some of the stuff they're doing is outrageous. Let me give you an example. When in February 28th, when they finally said, well, masks don't really work, let's move you to N95s. And I said, well, wait a second. Now you've moved into the respiratory protection standard. You just can't tell stores and people to give an N95s out because they're technically respirators.
Right.
And you'll incur large liability if you don't follow the respiratory protection standard. Like, are they medically cleared? Have they been fit tested, et cetera, et cetera? And moreover, they said that they could be worn by children. And then they link you to like 3M's website for more information, or Moldex, and another maker of masks. And you click on, most people don't, I clicked on the 3M website and I go down the list and it has limitations, right? And it says, not intended for use with children. So you can't make this up. CDC recommends that you put kids in an N95. You click over to, it's on their site. Now they take you off the site to go to 3M, but it's one click and it says not for use with children. Now, how can you do that knowingly with either being incompetent or being completely dishonest? And so we wrote them and said, this is crazy stuff. And then the other thing that they did was on February 8th, they revised the child development guidance that had been in place for 18 years. In other words, when your child is young, at 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 30 months, etc., you're supposed to be able to say so many words, roll over, do certain things, right? Well, they found that the children are losing upwards of 23% per year of development. Because the parents or the kids wearing masks. They can't see facial expressions, for example.
Well, it's critical.
So what did CDC do? Instead of admitting that this is causing problems, they moved the goalpost on February 8th. They took those 18-year-old development goals and they shifted them forward for over about 20% of them. In other words, if you had to be able to say so many words at 24 months, they now said, well, you don't have to do it until 30 months. This is crazy stuff. So rather than admitting the harms being done, they just move the goalposts.
Well, it's the old redefining terms, and we'll just change the definition to fit what we want to achieve. I know I don't want to get into that whole conversation, but that's how we got here.
Well, yeah, my conclusion is that, and this is why we won't, and I'm not a medical doctor, we won't get into it, but I've been on the stage with Dr. McCullough, who's well known, pushing therapeutics and other things, and not so much of a proponent of the vaccines, but we'll leave him and others to discuss that. But when I found out that upwards of 80% of the people that died from COVID didn't need to die if they'd had some early treatment, at least that's what's alleged, I said, well, I can't do anything about that, but I can do something about the masks. In my view, the masks were the pillars or the foundation for control, because there's certainly no science to say they do any good. So what's the purpose of them? It has to be, I always say all people are rational in their own minds. So what is the rationality that drives people to say wear masks? It isn't for public health. It really isn't. So it has to be control. And I thought, well, that's when I spent a lot of resources and a lot of time saying, you know what, I'm going to step out and I'm going to try to destroy the foundation for masks. And because I think it's the initial rung or the foundation for all of this compliance nonsense that's been pushed. So am I right about that or not? Who knows? But there's certainly in my mind, there's not legitimate science, and hasn't been for decades, to support the use of masks or masking. Yeah. And so the only conclusion you draw is it has to do with something else.
We can leave that for another podcast to tackle, but you're right. And so one of my big takeaways here, other than the data you shared and the graphics that you shared, are very compelling, obviously. And that is the big question I had for us as safety professionals that live and work in communities is to continue to speak, to continue to talk. You mentioned civil disobedience. It never used to be called disobedience. It used to be just called civil debate. It used to just be called, participating in civil discourse. Right. But now it's moved, that Overton window has shifted. And now if you go to speak at a school board about an issue, for or against, doesn't matter what the issue is, if you cut in the other direction to the consensus, that's called disobedience. And I hate that, but you're right. That's where we've ended up with this.
It's censorship. And I grew up in Seattle and certainly not right of center, and went to the University of Washington for many years. And I'm older, so in the 70s, but we would die on the vine to allow all people to speak. Yep. I mean, that was, let's let the debate rage, and what will come out of that will probably be the best answer. And so censorship to me isn't even a left or right issue. It's almost a Marxist issue. But we have to continue to speak up. And then the last thing I would add to that whole string of comments about what people can do is, I've been implementing real engineering controls in real buildings for the last 2 years, and they seem to work. And the data are increasingly showing that they work. And so I provided the back end of this both presentations, particularly the most recent one, all the data on costs, how they work, what their effectiveness is. And so the reader or the listener of this material can take a look there to provide real solutions not just be a critic of the silliness of masks, but say, look, we can do some real things based on fundamental, decades-old science to provide solutions that work. And I think you have to do that in order to be effective.
Yeah, and that's key. At the end of the day, we're all safety professionals. We all want to protect our employees or the public, depending upon what type of safety professional you are. And that's what this is about. This discussion isn't masks are stupid or anything like that. To your point, it is, if we're going to get serious about protecting the public, or in my case, start with what is going to actually protect our workers, we need to be focusing on solutions that actually work. I mean, wasting our time, money, resources. And the other problem is this became a bureaucratic nightmare, which is it no longer, once it was settled, it was like, you can't talk about, not masking anymore. You have to mask. Then it became all of our energy and focus and effort was enforcing the mask, enforcement in public stores, in our businesses. It was, do you have your mask on? Or hey, put it up over your nose. We moved from what can we do to effectively mitigate the hazard to policing. Right. And people were fired. There were fights. There was workplace violence. There were people that were shot and killed in stores for telling customers they couldn't come in. It was insane what we did to our citizens.
These emotional tools are so powerful. If somebody truly believes that you not wearing a mask is going to cause people to die, then they respond appropriately.
Yeah. And that's sad.
I would early on, I'd walk through a Walmart or whatever store, and I just wouldn't wear the mask, and I would dare somebody to say something to me. Now it's harder when you're an employee,
yes,
et cetera. But I really do believe we're turning the corner on this in terms of people are understanding. I will say this: I've been privileged enough to be in front of a lot of juries. And it used to be you'd hear all the time, well, juries are blue collar, or they're not very smart, or whatever, and they make bad decisions. But I'll tell you, win or lose, I've come to the conclusion that the juries generally get it right. And they may not have all the book sense, but they've got a lot of common sense. And my observation is that we're seeing the same thing now, is that people know something isn't right. And the time to stomp on this thing is now. And you're even starting to see it in the courts. This whole process takes longer than we'd all like, but there.
I think
about working to change that equation.
Yeah, you're right, and I think the reason why it's taken longer is if you think about the way most people communicate, share thoughts, ideas, and communicate with each other today than 15, even 10 years ago, and that is, look what we're doing. Right. Where is this going to go? This is going to be a podcast. This is going to be a video. Or they go to Twitter and share information. They go try to look stuff up online. Well, you mentioned censorship earlier, and I don't want this, to be the big takeaway for this episode. That had consequences on the information most of us had access to, actual information.
In 2020, I put out 2 video podcasts on why masks can't and don't work, and then what are the solutions. And they got enormous viewership in the first 2 weeks. I mean, tens of thousands. Mm-hmm. And they were pulled. They were censored, and they wrote me and said medical misinformation. So I wrote them and said, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm an exposure expert, and I'm trying to protect people. They were not impressed. They said, too bad. So then I had to move to Rumble, which they're out there, but you don't get the same...
The reach.
You don't get the same reach. So, and many people who have commented on this have been censored. And so you cut off the information flow, so people naturally hear one side of the argument and not so much the other side. And that's why.
And I think that is why, to your comment of it's taken longer than it should have, but we're starting to now. I think that's what it was. They couldn't stop it. They could only delay it. They could only slow it down. But naturally, because of the way societies work and the way societies communicate, it just took it longer to get this information out there. Are there any changes coming, any new data, new studies? I know you're going to give a presentation. Maybe let's plug that and where people might be able to find information.
Yeah, there's a group being formed by Stand Up Michigan that's called Frontline IHs. And there are 8 of us that are going to give half-hour talks next week. And then it's going to be widely disseminated, and there's a big attempt to get media to grab it. Now, we won't get the reach we want, but it's another attempt. So that's out there. But I will cite, let me help real quick there, just to give you some idea on some of the literature that's come along. You know, the first study that really showed that masks don't work was the Danish study by Bundgaard, where they had basically 3,000 people without masks and 3,000 people with masks, and they looked to see if there was any difference in how many people got sick with COVID. And within the statistics, the answer was there was no difference. And so that study took months to get published because it had the wrong answer, right? I mean, that's my opinion. And it did finally get cited. And it's the one really well-controlled study. And CDC to this day dumps on it and says, well, the reason that it's not so good is it only studied 0.1% of the population of Denmark. Well, I'm like, well, of course, more is better, but in what world?
You can extrapolate from that.
In what world does epidemiology get tied to a percentage of the country's population? I mean, that's just nonsense. If you extract that to the U.S., I think it's like 350,000 people or something. Well, most epidemiology studies don't have many people. Now, there have been, in this year, there have been 3 additional studies that people may want to focus on, and they're on slides 9, 10, and 11 of my recent handout. One is by Benny Spear out of Europe, and what he did is he plotted COVID rates by country in Europe versus high mask compliance, low mask compliance. And what he found was that countries with the highest mask wearing had the highest COVID death rates.
Really?
Yes. That's kind of the bottom line conclusion. You can read it. I've given the URL in these handouts. At the bottom of each handout, I put the URL in so you can study for free. Then the other one is a guy named Zacharias Fogan, who did a study on Kansas counties where some counties had mask mandates, some counties didn't. And he concluded that the highest fatality rates were, what did he say? He said counties with mask mandates had significantly higher case fatality rates than counties without masks. So, and he concludes, quote unquote, this study revealed that wearing face masks may impose a great risk on individuals who would otherwise not be mitigated by reduction in infectious rate. Now, let me talk a little bit about masks, and this is based on my background in mold and stuff. The mask itself provides ideal conditions for amplification of mold and bacteria of all kinds. What do I mean by that? Well, the temperature and humidity is ideal for amplification, and most people don't understand that word amplification. So, like for mold, if you don't see mold on a wall, the spore count's less than 10,000 spores per square inch. If you see it, it's like over 1 million. So it doesn't go from 10,000 to 12,000. It goes from 10,000 to several million. It exponentially amplifies. So you can imagine you breathe out, the reason you breathe out partly is you rid your body of toxins, right? So each breath has some toxins in it. Well, if some of those get on the mask and the conditions are right for amplification, temperature and humidity, then amplified, then you rebreathe in those toxins at a much orders of magnitude higher concentration. So it's no surprise that we're starting to see studies that show death rates are higher for people that wear masks than not. It may be other toxins. It might be staph or whatever else you're breathing out.
Right. So it's a combination. People are so focused on COVID. COVID may have opened a door. It may have weakened you, but then it's all that other stuff, the increased toxins and bacteria growth and everything from that hot, humid, moist air over covering your face. That's where you get the pneumonia and the other illnesses that cause you to die.
So it's not a surprise to us in the industrial hygiene community that if you have a surface that allows for amplification of a toxin, and then you rebreathe it, that's going to give you some problems.
Yeah.
The last study is there was two studies. One work by Oster that was in 2021. And as part of that work, they looked at Florida schools with and without masks for both the students and the teachers.
Yeah, the Florida school one, yeah.
And that showed essentially no differences between wearing and not wearing a mask. Well, this was followed up in some respects, and this is on page 13 of my most recent stuff, by work by Sode, Hike, Stevenson, and Hogue, who you may have heard of her before. And what they did is they looked at schools in North Dakota. One was Fargo School District that had a mask mandate, and West Fargo School District, which did not. And they found there was no statistical difference in disease rates between the school districts with and without masks. Now, an interesting follow-up is after half the school year in January or so, Fargo took off the mask mandate and made it voluntary. And if you follow that cohort between the data between wearing a mask and not wearing a mask within that district, you don't see a difference. So that work just came out, in the last month or so.
Yeah. And that was within the same district between schools that had mandates and not.
It first did the fall half or the fall winter semester. It did West Fargo versus Fargo, mask mandate, no mask mandate. But then they also looked at when Fargo took the mask mandate off as a follow-up, were the rates any different than when they had the mask mandate? And they weren't.
Right.
So all of this says basically that masks don't make a difference in schools. And it's so harmful. And this was all statistically significant stuff. So, and given the harms that occur to children in learning, and that doesn't even include the psychological and the physical harms, you just have to wonder about why this is being done. And I don't think there are good answers.
Man, it's incredible. Hey, Stephen, thanks so much for taking time to share all of this. I'll get links from you. I want to make sure that I send people to the right places for information that you have. Anybody listening on audio only, the podcast, go to the Safety Pro podcast community site to check out the video, to see the graphics that he was talking about as he discusses them. It's free to watch there. You don't have to join and become a member of the community. I want to make sure that we make this available to everybody that wants to view it. Stephen, thanks so much again for joining us and talking about this important issue.
Thank you, and thanks for getting the word out, because that's what we need.
All right, there you go. I told you, folks, talking with Stephen Petty about this topic. Go ahead and check out the video on the Safety Pro podcast community. It's up there for everybody to see. The link is in the show notes if you want to see the graphs that we were showing during the interview. And you do not have to join to watch that video, although I wish you would join us over at the community. We have really good conversations. We want to mix it up over there and have conversations you're not going to have anywhere else. So join us over there at the Safety Pro podcast community, and I will talk to you on the next Safety Pro podcast.